If you're an HR professional who works hard to fill roles within your company, keep employees engaged, and build company culture, welcome to America Back to Work, where dreams only work if we do. We'll share wide-ranging issues surrounding pre-employment background screening, HR topics such as recruiting, hiring, labor trends, and company culture, as well as broader HR-influenced business topics such as customer experience, service level excellence, and protecting what matters through best practices in prevention, protection, and corporate security. America Back to Work is brought to you by S2 Verify. Here's your host, Arnette Heintze.
Welcome to America Back to Work, brought to you by S2 Verify, where our purpose is to help you hire with confidence and manage insider risk. I'm your host, Arnette Heintze. Today, I'm joined by recruiting industry innovators Junie Ham and Dave Burke. They are based in New York and are the co-founders of Beacon Talent, an embedded recruiting service with a very compelling business model that Junie and David will talk more about in just a minute. But first, let me share a little background on these two. Junie is an active angel investor and has invested in over 40 companies across a variety of industries. Previously, he was co-founder and president of Upside, which was acquired by Envestnet. Additionally, he has held senior executive roles leading marketing, strategy, and operations at high-growth companies including Hired, Airbnb, and Expedia. David also has a stellar background in this industry. Prior to launching Beacon Talent in 2018, David held growth-focused roles at Hired, Porch, and Harry. At Beacon, Junie and David bring their combined expertise, cutting-edge technology, and recruiting best practices to help companies elevate their game in the pursuit of talent to achieve their hiring goals. David, would you mind providing our listeners with a little background on Beacon and how your team is impacting the recruiting industry today?
Sure. Right. Thanks so much. Beacon is an embedded recruitment solution. So if you think about the recruiting services ecosystem, you have the traditional sort of contingent recruiting agency model, the executive search model, which both are very transaction oriented. For most growing organizations, identifying a partner, somebody who can complement and work very closely with an internal recruiting team to add capacity, to be able to sort of come in just in time, operate in a very sort of similar way, and utilize consistent processes and extension of that team, almost staff augmentation. That's really the position that Beacon plays in the market. And this enables us to work with companies across the entire spectrum of their hiring mandates. You know, it could be anything from engineering and product design to go-to-market roles like sales, marketing, and customer success.
Yep, great. Thank you, David. You know, as the two of you know firsthand, bad hires lead to high turnover rates, and ultimately this impacts the bottom line. Would you mind sharing your thoughts on how companies can best manage this issue in the extremely competitive labor market that we found ourselves in today?
Sure. I think it goes without saying that the cost of bad hires and turnover is immense. The U.S. Department of Labor claims that it could be up to 30% of the employee's first year salary. And I've seen other figures ranging from tens of thousands of dollars to up to hundreds of thousands of dollars in sort of lost value. Not only does this cost account for the time hiring, onboarding, training, and ultimately terminating a bad hire, but I'd argue a big piece of the puzzle is the opportunity cost of putting that wrong person in seat. That person is performing below expectations. And in certain cases, the impact of a toxic employee spreading, negativity or exhibiting bad behaviors to the broader organization is additionally, on top of that cost. And so, in a competitive labor market, I would say the time to hire also increases, and it often means additional spend that a talent team would need to deploy in order to bring on additional candidate pipeline. And also that cost is magnified in terms of the length of the time that role remains unfilled.
Yeah. And that kind of goes in line with, once a company has a bad hire, I've also seen where they don't move quick enough to terminate that individual. So that just, to your point about how it's impacting things, negatively in the organization is so true. With unemployment rates near historic lows right now, how is this impacting the search for talent? And what do the two of you expect over the next couple of years? I mean, everybody's, talking about we're potentially headed into a recession. What are your thoughts in this area, and how are you working with clients in this space?
Yeah, I can take that one. I think it's important when we talk about labor market shortages to think both about the fact that there's many different segments of the labor market. It's a very large, diverse ecosystem. So that's one. And then the second is to think about the fact that there are what I would say are systemic challenges to labor shortage and then more market-driven forces. So touching first on segmentation, the majority of the types of companies we work with and types of roles that we work on tend to be what I would call knowledge workers. Folks that can work remotely and are typically engaged in activities that don't have a dependence on being in a physical space, right? If you think about the other segment of the market, we'll often talk about is the services sector. And if you look at the most recent jobs reports, you can see a lot of the increase in jobs has been driven through that service sector. Leisure and hospitality has been a big driver recently. So in terms of those systemic forces, I think we do a lot of work with software engineering type organizations, IT. There's been for the last 15 or 20 years a systemic shortage of engineers. So no matter what the market dynamics are at a given time, you're always going to be dealing with that. But in other ends of the labor market as well, you mentioned I worked at Harry, which was a human capital management platform for the hospitality industry, and finding back of house staff has always been a systemic challenge as well. And so those challenges exist in every segment of the market. And then if you look at what are the current market dynamics, you can see the Fed is actively working to drive us towards, they don't want to go into recession, but obviously we're raising rates in hopes of slowing down the economy. And one of the biggest signals we're looking at is the monthly jobs report, right? So in any other world, if the jobs report was up, the stock market would be up, but we're seeing an inverse relationship now because everybody's waiting to start to see the economy slowing, which should drive down consumer prices. And so I think if we look down the road to 2023, and Judy and I talk a lot about this on a daily basis, but we're sort of seeing probably a continued steady slowing of the economy for the first half of 2023. And honestly, for us, when we look at that knowledge worker segment of the economy, we've been seeing that crashing for the last 6-8 months, right? The layoffs that are happening now are still flushing out, but that's been going on for a while. So I actually believe if and when we get to a recession, that'll be a signal to people that there's going to be hiring starting there. So if you're in that segment of the economy where you are an HR or a talent leader, you're going to be looking at things slowing for a while until that uptick begins to happen. If you're more on that service end of the economy, you're going to start to see things slow down a little bit over the next 3 to 6 months. But I actually think you're going to see a lot more slowdown towards the back half of 2023 when a lot of this plays out, and you're going to see, the impact of what the Fed is doing start to impact the jobs numbers.
Dave, you laid out a concept there that I think is intriguing, which is by the time we recognize we're in a recession, you think that potentially could be the start of maybe better hiring, because typically recessions, we're coming out of them after, 18 months, give or take, some less, some a little more. So by the time the word is official, that might be a sign of better things ahead then, because we're going to start anticipating more hiring.
I think so. I mean, it could be wishful thinking, but the difference between this recession and maybe think about 08-09, in 08-09, it kind of caught everybody by surprise, right? So we weren't anticipating it. Here, we're anticipating it. We understand there's a market correction underway. The Fed has been very clear that that's their goal. Again, their goal is not a recession, but their goal is to slow the economy, and the recession is a natural outcome of that. So I do believe when that happens, people are going to look and say, okay, mission accomplished for the Fed. Let's now, almost likely the Fed's going to, if not drop rates, definitely keep rates static. So they're not going to continue to increase, which will signal to that segment of the market it's time to move again. Now, at the same time, a lot of those knowledge workers are the folks that are driving up consumer prices. So when we look at, the increase in hospitality and leisure jobs, where's that coming from? It's coming from a lot of disposable income from that other segment of the market. Now you start to see these layoffs at Meta and Google and all these other places. That's going to start to play out. Those are leading indicators of those jobs that are going to contract, 6 months from now.
Yep. The recent labor force participation rate remains low. It's just at over 62%. And I believe it's likely adding fuel to the tight labor market that we find ourselves in today. Are you finding recruiting teams doing anything different as they search for talent in this low rate environment? You know, as we were talking earlier, I think in the 90s and early 2000s, we had that participation rate level was higher. And so now maybe there's a little apathy among the workforce, and that with a number of 62%, there's obviously some gains we can have to put more people back at work, even though we've got a low unemployment rate. How do you feel about that?
I could take that one, actually. So at this point, we've all heard the term the Great Resignation, or have experienced it directly or maybe indirectly in some way. Dave talked a lot about some of the macro forces and some of the headwinds that we've been facing over the last few years. There are many components to that. And I would say that is one part of it. You know, there isn't a single reason, I would say, that is causing labor force participation to remain low, but a lot of changes have happened that are, I would say, almost societal, that is changing the nature of work, changing the way that individuals perceive work. And that could be something from, say, the shift in the way that we've done work caused by the pandemic. Many companies went remote, and they positioned themselves as, remote first or fully remote companies in a world where just a couple of years ago, even months beforehand, that was not a consideration that many companies really sort of evaluated. Yeah. And at the same time, in this year, many of those companies that have said we would be fully remote forever are now actually implementing return to office mandates. And so if you think about labor participation, and going back to Dave's point, I think it is really dependent on the sector or the type of work or the sort of categories of companies and the types of employees that they employ. But I would say that the nature of work shifting and people having gone through so much burnout and sort of psychological strain from dealing with the pandemic is impacting labor participation in a way that I don't think we've seen, at least in terms of the layering effect of all these different challenges, really, for many years, many decades. I would say in terms of what companies can do to address it, without getting too tactical, I would say the number one thing that companies should consider is, given that the balance of power is tipping towards employees, given the labor force participation rate being low, I would say that's important to listen to what employees want as part of their professional experience. Everything from, intrinsic motivations, sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as a perspective to, say, mission alignment or the types of benefits that candidates actually value versus what companies believe that candidates have valued in the past. I think having a two-way conversation, allows employers to sort of receive that feedback and then process it and deploy relevant changes that are still authentic to the company's mission and culture, and impact potential employees, candidates, in a way that get them more excited about, working.
Yep, great. When helping a client recruit, hire, and onboard new talent, how do you help ensure that the new team member will be a good fit with the company's culture? Junie, you were just talking about the culture aspect of an organization. So how do you help with that?
Well, kind of extending that sort of component around having that two-way conversation, I think that companies at this point are really challenged to differentiate their offering as it relates to how employees participate in the organization. There's a lot that has been done in the last few years, particularly around things like ERG, employee resource groups, and diversity, equity, inclusion. The labor force, particularly the current generation, are really valuing these components as part of what they want to experience working at companies. And so as it relates to onboarding, I would say that given that all of these changes are sort of layering on, so whether that is a company is shifting from working in the office to remote, or they're going and acquiring talent more globally, folding in these considerations as it relates to both the recruiting process and onboarding and ultimately the way that they do work is just really, really important. And I think the word that I would use here is authenticity. It's making sure that the components around how you onboard, the components around how you integrate new employees into the overall organization has to come from a place where the mission is aligned really deeply with that, and it doesn't feel like that work is done primarily to for efficiency purposes or for just making sure that, the bottom line is maintained. I would say that the current generation employees can see right through that, and really quickly.
Yeah. So as we've been discussing, competition for talent is fierce right now. What strategies are you suggesting to clients to gain an advantage in recruiting the top talent in the global workforce? Are there specific examples that maybe you guys can cite to kind of give your clients an edge up in this constant pursuit of talent?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of people pay us to try and give them the answer. Look, the thing I say a lot is there's no silver bullet when it comes to recruiting and talent acquisition. There's a lot of lead bullets, and it needs to be a coordinated effort. You need to have a strategy and the ability to execute against that consistently. So you can draw a lot of parallels between the actual effort and the process of talent attraction or recruiting to sales and marketing, right? Very, very similar. Any marketer will tell you that you need to have a multi-channel strategy. You need to approach people from many different angles. That's to just get them engaged. Then from there, Junie talks a lot about authenticity and culture. A lot of times we get companies who say, we're looking for somebody who's a culture fit. And I usually will reflect that back to them and say, well, what does culture mean to you? How do you define that? And a lot of people don't have a very clear and sharp answer for that. And so that's a great place to start, is understanding, as an organization, what are the things that you value and what are the things that you do, the rituals as an organization, because oftentimes that's actually what comprises your culture. And so your ability to engage people, particularly people who have a lot of optionality, which is one of the drivers that's been leading to this lower workforce participation rate and the tightness in the market, is very important. You don't have to engage everybody in the market. You have to engage the people that are going to resonate with the opportunities that you have. So it's a combination of really knowing, what behavioral patterns, profiles, people are you looking for? What types of skill sets do you need, as a combination of those two? How do you go out and get on those people's radar in terms of the many different channels you can use to engage with them? And then how do you construct a message and an opportunity that aligns with their incentives? And that's really the high level approach.
That's wonderful. As the economy contracts, we're going to see HR and recruiting budgets tighten as well. Do you have any suggestions for these teams then what they can do on, hiring new members and onboarding, how they can do so in a tighter economic environment?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll bring it back to the first question you asked, which is how do you, prevent turnover, because turnover is the biggest cost. And I think, the biggest thing that HR teams need to think about and really get their leadership team thinking about is we can't be a penny wise and a dollar foolish, right? A lot of times, hey, let's just move fast. Let's try and, get some quick wins to try and get people in the door. That's where a lot of times things lead to bad hires, bad turnover. You're not going to know that until, 90 days after somebody started. And so investing the time and the effort in having the right set of processes and tools is very, very important. We work with a lot of companies who have an applicant tracking system. We'll go in and we'll see that the applicant tracking system isn't really being used that well because the process isn't solidified first. The tool isn't going to solve a lack of process. And so being thoughtful about that, being aligned as an organization is the best way to conserve costs and resources, long term. And then beyond that, it's about being resourceful. I mean, one of the biggest things that we're seeing is that the first people to be laid off in a bad economic environment tends to be the recruiting team. You're not hiring people, so you're definitely not using your recruiters. And so that's part of the reason why Beacon exists. We are a fractional embedded recruitment solution so that when you're scaling up and you're hiring a lot of people, you don't have to grow your talent acquisition team as big, which creates a lot of fixed cost structure, right? Rather, you start to offset that through, you working with a group like us, and there's many, groups that participate in this set of the recruitment services market. And then when you're scaling down or slowing your hiring, you're not in a situation where you have a big overstaffed team and then you have to do, layoffs and headcount reductions. So I think it's solutions like us. And again, we're not even, we're not a silver bullet. We're part of a thoughtful, broader talent strategy. But thinking about those types of solutions is also a really important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. I've seen some reporting that more than 3/4 of employees say they're ready to learn new skills or completely retrain. Are you seeing companies adapting to these demands from the workforce for more professional development? I mean, I've seen some thought out there that employees are looking for continuous development.
Mm.
How are you seeing that in the market today with the companies you're supporting?
I can talk to that one. Look, I think every talent and HR leader knows that this is important. If you think about the values of the workforce, particularly as we have kind of the millennial Gen Z workforce coming in, they really value learning and development. You can see that on any survey, and so it's very important. So I think everybody knows that. I think the challenge is, how do you actually execute on that? How do you implement that? And how do you sort of justify it, right? You have to have a perspective that there's going to be an ROI for your organization to invest in those, in that upskilling. And so, what types of roles can be upskilled? How can they be upskilled? I think one of the biggest opportunities when you think about upskilling is that it means you can afford to make a trade-off in terms of the skill that somebody brings, right? So if you need somebody to have, 5 years of accounting experience, but maybe they only have 2 years of accounting experience, but you have a good upskilling program, that gives you access to a bigger pool of talent, and it creates an opportunity for somebody who can come in and actually is going to value that learning and development. So I think incorporating that into your hiring and recruiting strategy can help a lot. But at the same time, you have to be realistic. When Junie and I worked together at Hire.com, we partnered with a lot of the dev boot camps. These were, kind of a thing where they would train, people to become developers over 6 months, then try and get them into organization. The problem is those folks could only be successful when they went to much larger engineering organizations where there was enough capacity and slack for people to actually spend time training and mentoring them. Yeah. If you put those people into a smaller engineering organization, they just don't get enough focus and time and attention, and it doesn't work out. And so the reality is, for an individual organization, you also have to understand you have meaningful constraints in terms of your team's time to actually do that work and upskilling.
Yeah, right. Completely agree with that. And also to maybe take the question in a slightly different direction, as well as you kind of question this idea of learning new skills, professional development, but also retraining or kind of entering a completely new sort of skill set or discipline. One thing I've read is that almost 40% of workers believe their jobs will be obsolete in the next 5 years, which really is reflective of maybe concern or sort of nervousness that the rate of change in industry is just happening so quickly. If you think about just anecdotally, right, there are so many articles about robots and automation impacting manufacturing jobs, to recent advances in AI creating fear and uncertainty, and even more creative pursuits or even software engineering. I think this is just something that's going to continue to come up. And as it relates to professional development, a lot of what Dave has said is true. And we're also in an environment where companies have less slack, right? They are reducing, they're creating efficiency. And so it becomes more difficult to rationalize that, within an organization, if they want to be able to do that. So I think that concern is just going to continue to be something that the broader economy will need to kind of reconcile with the fact that a lot of employees and workers are saying that they want to develop new skills, they want to retrain, but in a fairly challenging environment today.
Yeah. At S2 Verify, we're trying to do the best we can to help clients make the best hires that they can. And we do this through, verification services and background screening services. Have you seen a trend in over the last couple of years, given the dynamics we've gone through of coming out of a pandemic? Have you seen any different trends with pre-employment background screening with any of your clients?
I think the trend that we have seen is continued and broader adoption of this is one. So in our role, we're typically not administering that. That's usually handled by the internal HR people operations team. We're asked often to do reference checks, and we think that's very important. But we've seen organizations where we're doing reference checks and there's not a background check. So generally our advice whenever we're working with an organization is you should absolutely be doing this if you're not already. And I think more and more companies who maybe don't traditionally have a compliance issue around this are doing it as an optional effort, understanding that it's critically important. So I think, yes, I'm just seeing broader growth and application to this across the board.
Yeah, great. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your experience, thoughts, and ideas around the latest trends in recruiting and HR. And if anyone is listening, looking for an innovative recruiting solutions, I think, Beacon Talent is certainly up there and you should be checking them out. And I think it's always best to give my guests the last word. So here it goes. If I ran an S2 verified background check on the two of you, what would be the most surprising discovery, if anything? And Dave, we'll let you go first.
Well, interestingly, I recently was elected to our local school board, so I don't know if that would come up in the background check, but it'd be the first time, I guess, I would know. So
we could
probably
certainly
the most interesting thing.
Yeah, we would figure that out in the verification process. And how about you, Johnny? Anything in that?
I was thinking about it as you asked the question, and in terms of background checks, for a 10-year period, I actually had 10 different addresses because I had moved so frequently.
Yeah.
And so I think that would probably raise some sort of flag if you looked, because during that period, I lived everywhere from Los Angeles to San Francisco to Seattle to St. Louis, and now in New York. So that's probably something that would come up.
One thing it tells us is this guy's on the move. That's for sure. So please tell our audience where they can find more information about Beacon Talent, if you would, for a second.
Yeah, you can find us on our website at beacontalent.io. We're online there.
Great. Well, guys, thank you again so much for joining me today. And thanks to all of you listening, watching, or reading. Please tune in next week when award-winning author and former CIA intelligence officer Carmen Amado joins me. And it goes without saying, let's get America back to work, because dreams only work if we do.
If you want to stay abreast of HR, recruiting, and hiring trends, tips, and tools, make sure you subscribe to America Back to Work. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and a review.